Well, I'm sure many of you remember the incredible Double Star DB10 that reviewed not too long ago with this really cool stylized lower. You might notice the upper here is not Double Star. In fact, it looks a little different. This upper is from Genesis and it is 12 gauge. That's right, slapping this upper on converts your AR10 to a 12 gauge. We'll be taking a closer look coming up, along with some of the rounds that I intend on running through this thing. Coming up next on GBGuns. Alright, welcome back. There is a lot to go over on this thing, so before I get too into it, get comfortable. There's a reason why we haven't seen something like this happen before. And that's because it takes a lot of innovation to make this work. So Genesis Arms has spent a lot of time developing this and figuring out how to make a 12 gauge upper function on an AR10 lower. Why an AR10? Well, for one, it's 12 gauge. Two, you're going to have a decent magazine size just as a requirement to be able to fit those rounds in there. So what they've done is this bolt is spring loaded to lock in. You can see there. And the barrel actually reciprocates a little bit like you see on, let's see, artillery pieces or BMG 50s, things like that. Really cool design. Completely theirs, done in-house. Now you see I've already got some stuff on here. There's some iron sights and an EOTech and a forward grip. The barrel is threaded, same pattern as all the Saiga stuff. So as far as using chokes or muzzle devices, that's available. I plan on trying out this big guy that I got from Carolina Shooter Supply a while back for Saigas and the Lynxes, etc. But there's a lot of things to consider. Before I go into that, I'm going to pull this bolt out and show you what the bolt looks like. Gonna have to remove the charging handle here. It is a fixed reciprocating charging handle on the right side. Look how smoothly that glides. This is precision machining at its max. In fact, listen to the tightness of the aluminum. Look at that ring. That's beautiful. So to do that, need a hex key to spin this off. I'll pull the bolt out and we'll take a look at the bolt. So as you can see, it's got that massive 12 gauge face, spring loaded. This is a T&E sample, so it has been fired and it's got some grit on it already. But one thing that fascinated me about it is there isn't necessarily a ton of material. It's rather lightweight for a 12 gauge bolt, which is exciting because in blowback or recoil operated stuff, usually what you feel, the slam in your shoulder, is from reciprocating mass, and this isn't particularly too much mass. We've got a firing bit. This is constructed very much like an AR bolt, except of course you don't have a need for a gas key. Looking inside the receiver, you can see a nice solid chunk of aluminum that this was cut from, and there's the barrel. Let's see if I can get that to push back. So you can see the barrel extension comes back a little there, and all of those lug faces to interface with the bolt itself. Spring loaded, and these can be tuned to specific loads, which is pretty neat. I'll show you some of the challenges that come into play when you're trying to create something like this. So here is some of the variety of rounds that I plan to try running through this. It's a mix of birdshot, we got slugs, we got buckshot, 1100 feet per second, 1200 feet per second, 1400 feet per second, and they all claim to be 2 3/4. Now I've been very careful to line up the base of these shells so that the rims are all together, and you'll notice looking along the top that they're not all the same length. So what happens is when that goes into a magazine, the amount of distance that has to be covered coming out of the magazine changes. And so that also leaves room for the round to shift under recoil, things like that. Another issue that I experienced in my Vepr 12 days is that some plastics have more friction than others. So like this wolf is fairly smooth, has those ribs on it, right? So that creates some friction or resistance, especially when sliding over another round. Whereas like this Browning is smooth, but surprisingly less slick, if you will. There's more surface area to create friction. So that all creates different challenges in feeding. Then depending on the weight of the load and the velocity of the load, we're going to have different amount of energy generated to cycle the gun. Keep in mind this is using your standard AR10 lower with a few slight modifications that I'll cover in a moment. But these different rounds all create their own challenges and are part of why box magazine fed 12 gauges are rather uncommon, especially in the semi-auto world. Now that I've mentioned the modifications to a lower that you may or may not need but are strongly suggested, let's take a look at those and I'll show you why. So this is a 5-round box magazine that is currently available from Genesis. They also have a prototype 10-round. They're working on the geometry of it. I've got one here. There are some challenges to making this fit on an AR. For one, you have to match this curved cut to the curved cut on the upper. So, for example, I have two AR10s on hand, the Stag 10S and the Double Star 10B. The Stag has a diagonal cut here, so it won't work with it, but it does mate up to the Double Star. Why is that? Well, that's because the AR10 doesn't have a mil spec. There is no official way of making an AR10, so that leaves manufacturers up to create their own pattern. This pattern happens to work with the Genesis setup. The catch for me was that the Double Star has this nice flared large magwell, great for grabbing, which unfortunately also makes it a challenge to fit different magazine size or shapes, and if the magazine is very fat, it won't make it in here. You notice that this one does. You also notice that I can't just shove it right in. Right? It bounces out. I have to push the magazine release to get it to lock in. That seems like a bummer, except Genesis Arms has this in their beef up kit. If I can get the camera to focus on it here, you can take a look and you see the mag catch is beveled in both directions, whereas your standard AR10 mag catch is squared off. So what that means is that square blocks this magazine. You have to move the magazine release for the magazine to come in, and then it catches. So Genesis Arms offers these and recommends them. I can see why. It makes it a lot quicker, as well as an increased tension catch spring. That's because, well, this is a 12 gauge, so it's got a different recoil impulse. In velocity and energy testing that I've experienced and been a part of, one of the main things that makes 12 gauge feel so different to the shooter is not so much that there is more recoil, but that the recoil impulse is longer than in your standard rifle shooting. So while rifle snaps, 12 gauge tends to push. And so that means that the duration of the force that wants to rock this magazine and the rounds in it is longer than it is in your standard rifle. Another change that they have is this bolt catch and release, which you might notice is squared on top versus the conventional angled top that's on an AR. That is so that when this pops up, it can function reliably in your gun. So they include that along with the spring for it and have some anti-walk pins recommended. Now the Double Star already has it because once again, we've got a lot of a different kind of recoil, if you will, to handle. So those are included to swap into your lower to make it work. I wanted to show you some of the brilliance that they've done in making this function. Notice this magazine follower looks quite a bit different than your standard 12 gauge box magazine. This little tab back here is actually what trips your last round bolt hold open. See right there? So if I push on that, that's going to push down the follower. So that brings the round down to an appropriate height, lets the bolt run over, and these steps help not only keep the rounds from moving around too much, but help pop the round up into the chamber. Loading is a lot simpler than I've experienced on other 12 gauge mags. There you have it. You see these grasping arms here add a little bit of tension to keep the round there in place. And then as it's fed, part of the feed ramp is actually inside the magazine to pop the round up and forward. Brilliant. There's a lot that has to go into magazine design. So hats off to Genesis, not only for making this upper exist, but a magazine that appears anyways from the design to speak pretty highly of the engineers and make something that runs. So we'll see which rounds will run this and which won't. Another thing to consider with this threaded barrel is if you're going to put a brake on here, right, this is going to add weight to the barrel that has to reciprocate. So this one is aluminum. It's nice and lightweight from Carolina Shooter Supply. There are some heavier ones out there, even ones that are smaller than this, that might add too much weight to this to run with light loads. So that's going to be another thing we're going to have to experiment with to see what works and what doesn't. Like I said, I've got a variety of different birdshot loads, some buckshot loads, and some slugs to see how it runs. Really excited to try this out. It essentially turns your one gun into two guns once you make the changes to your AR10 lower, which don't impact reliability as an AR10. All you got to do is slap this upper on and suddenly you've got a 12 gauge. Very cool concept. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. This is once again, it's from Genesis Arms. Comment below and I'll get out to the range as soon as I can and run some rounds through this. Both myself and we'll get Maddie on there. She's a little bit lighter weight. I've noticed in the past with recoil operated stuff, it comes down to how stout you are and being able to support the gun. Same thing with like limp wristing a handgun. The same thing can happen on big rifles if you're not putting enough ooey behind it. I think this forward grip should really help for bearing down and grabbing on. But really looking forward to trying this thing. Going to try some patterns as well to see what comes out of this barrel. The barrel is marked, laser etched. You can see down there through the M-LOK slots. Genesis Arms. This is all their own doing. Very cool, very innovative product, and I'm very excited to have it in my hands. Thanks for watching.